Good evening and welcome to the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. Let's talk art. Tonight we're going to listen to a conversation between Sarah Hall, the director, and Daniel Falco, the curator. They're going to be talking about Dutch Golden Age. I just want to go over just a couple of things before we start. It is a webinar format, so if you would like your voice to be heard or you have a question during the presentation, down at the bottom there's a chat or a Q&A. You can just click on that and let us know what your questions are. And then Jillian McMaster or myself, Kelly Mealy, will interject at some point and we will let them know you have a question when it's appropriate. We'll also have a little Q&A at the end as well. And throughout the course of the presentation, you might get a couple questions from Sarah Hall about what's going on, what they're talking about, just to get your input and your perspective. So feel free to add your thoughts in that chat bar as well. And we will be looking and scrolling through as the presentation is taking place. Enjoy. Sarah Hall.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining us tonight. We kind of didn't give a lot of advance notice for this one. What we are doing for the next couple of months is using our promise of a monthly art conversation to flesh out some ideas related to the exhibition that just opened at the museum last week called The Dutch Golden Age, Prints by Rembrandt and His Contemporaries. And it is a really beautiful show with more than 60 prints, a lot of really engrossing, fascinating imagery in that show. And we thought tonight we would go deeper into the Dutch Golden Age because it is such an incredible period in art where so many familiar names, household names of artists come from, and so much of what we think of as painting is rooted in. So I wanted to do a little commercial before we start. So I'm going to my notes here. In addition to the exhibition, we still have the Jan Brett, the World of Jan Brett exhibition up, which has more than 70 illustrations from her really beloved children's books. If you know The Mitten, I think that's one that my son and I shared many times. You will love this show. They're almost like illuminations, these gouaches and watercolors with incredible detail and rich colors. She works a lot with the margins of the page. They're just really engrossing and beautiful in a way that's really not that different than the engrossing quality of the prints. So I keep telling people it's a great sort of family visit to the museum because you have kid-friendly and you have sort of connoisseur-friendly happening in the museum at the same time. And I'll say that I think we probably have more folks going back to streaming their entertainment now that it's getting colder outside, and people may be feeling a little more claustrophobic and want to sort of do some armchair travel again. So we hope you will join us. Our next Let's Talk Art actually is scheduled for December 10th, and that is really, we're planning on some armchair travel. We want to take a closer look at the world of the Netherlands. I'm hoping that we can connect with somebody at the Rembrandt House Museum and our sister museum, the Singer Laren. That's going to be a sort of more travel focused presentation. We have some other things I want to promote tonight as well. December 1st at 10 a.m. we have a collaboration with the William Bush Planetarium. So there is a Jan Brett book that takes place at the North Pole and involves the Aurora Borealis. And so there's going to be a scientific explanation of the Aurora Borealis and investigation of it as a phenomena along with an art activity. So I think that sounds really fun. That'll be December 1st at 10 a.m., but it will be recorded. So you can get your paper and pastels and do it at home at your convenience whenever you would like. We also have coming up even sooner than that, November 28th, we're planning to have a cozy evening. I'm going to read The Mitten, and we're planning to have a mitten tree in the museum where people can drop off hats and mittens and scarves that we will donate to those in need. So the cozy evening will kick off our mitten tree. I want to emphasize again that I feel like the museum is a really safe place to be right now. We're stressed, we're staying within our comfortable spheres. The museum actually, we're seeing much lighter attendance than usual. Most of the time you have a gallery to yourself if you come, so mask up, and we've got hand sanitizer there for you, and you can really kind of get some balance back in your life by spending some time in the galleries, and we would really love to see you there from a distance, I promise. And that said, let's launch into tonight's program. I will start with questions while Daniel pulls up his PowerPoint and gets ready to talk. And the questions that I'm interested in hearing from is, what do you think of when you think of the Dutch Golden Age? Does that mean something to people? You can type that in the chat if you want to. And if there are particular artists that come to your mind, I'd love to know what those are. And do you think that the work, the art of this period has a certain kind of look? Like, what is the image that conjures in your mind of what paintings look like, or prints or imagery from that period? And then I might be tipping my hand here a little. Sometimes educators ask questions that have obvious answers for reasons, but do you think of any kind of commodities in particular when you think of the Netherlands during the Golden Age? Mostly just so that we talk about those as we go through. So that said, I'm going to let Daniel take over, and I will interrupt him at various points, and I will also come back to talk a little bit about a painting that I am really close friends with. So.
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I'm going to bring you into a closer look at this excellent exhibition called The Dutch Golden Age, Prints by Rembrandt and His Contemporaries. And it's an exhibition that runs from November 8 to January 24. And it is organized and circulated by the Reading Public Museum in Pennsylvania. And they have a very large collection of old master prints. One of the strengths of the collection are these really outstanding etchings and engravings that date from about the late 16th century all the way up through the 18th century. And tonight we're going to be taking a look at some of these. We're going to go through starting out with works done by Rembrandt, and then we're going to see how his style exerted an impact on other artists, coming in some cases all the way down through the 18th and early 19th century. So we're going to see kind of how his technique and style spread throughout Europe in the period in question.
So I'm going to interrupt you, Daniel, for a moment, because we did get one comment in the chat, which is that when this person thinks about the Dutch Golden Age, they say less about religion and more about everyday life, which is a great observation. So Daniel will talk about that, and we'll talk about that as we go through.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. And thank you for that comment, because this is a time period in which patrons and the increasingly prosperous middle class in the Netherlands begins to take an interest in works that are not entirely religious. They are scenes of everyday life, and they deal with lots of different themes. We're going to get to those as we go through the presentation and discussion tonight. But first of all, just to outline a couple of key points and takeaways from this exhibition, the Dutch Golden Age lasts from about 1581 to 1672. And it's a period in which the arts flourished. You have, as I was saying, this new Dutch middle class or burgher class of people that begins to have more means to collect art. And the period saw a rise as well in overseas colonial expansion of the Dutch Republic, the formation of an extensive trading empire. And the exhibition brings this entire period, the Golden Age, to life through this really compelling selection of works, not only religious scenes, but also myths from classical mythology and depictions of everyday life, as we call in art history, genre scenes. The works, as I mentioned, are made between the 1500s and the 1700s. And we're going to see how Rembrandt's printmaking style and technique were revolutionary, influencing many different artists. Here are some of the names of some of those artists. Important people directly connected to Rembrandt include Jan Levens, for example. You also have his influence on artists like Adriaan van Ostade, and also Jan van Vliet, who works in his studio. Rembrandt and his contemporaries work in a style called the Baroque, which is characterized by dramatic emotional subjects. And also in architecture, it refers to elaborate decoration. A couple of the images tonight, you'll see some of that elaborate ornamentation. Here's a map of 17th century Europe to situate us with what we're going to be looking at tonight. And here's the Dutch Republic. Some of the cities we'll be visiting virtually through art include Leiden, where Rembrandt is from, and also Amsterdam. We'll briefly mention Delft. But all of this incredible artistic activity is occurring here in the Dutch Republic. It also coincides with a rise in intellectual circles and advancements in science. From here, the Dutch are going to expand overseas in the Americas and also to the East in the East Indies, establishing their own East India Company. And how they do this is by mastering the seas, and they are quite the maritime empire, as you can see here in this painting by Ludolf Bachhuizen, which shows these boats weathering the seas. And pictures like this speak to the pride of the Dutch Republic, also their courageousness. And this is something of the optimism of the period, and it's reflected in many of the works as well. If you want to call them the spoils of this empire, or the riches that are brought back, include things from the New World, including foods and also gold, for example, and other minerals, the raw materials from their colonial empire that we can see reflected here in the Peter Clay still life. This has to do, though, with, of course, exploiting native peoples in the Americas, such as artist Franz Post. You see here his sugar factory and plantation. I should point out that before I go on, that when you see these captions, this refers to works that we're just showing in different collections. They are not represented in the exhibition. If it is represented in the exhibition, you will see in the caption RPM, which stands for Reading Public Museum, or WCMFA for our museum, Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. So Franz Post goes—
I'm going to interrupt for a moment too, right here to say that Daniel and I talked about this, that the Dutch Golden Age is an expression that's been used for a long time, and it is not without controversy these days when we're trying to look at things more equitably and trying to think more about the totality and diversity of experience. And so there are some museums in the Netherlands who don't really like to use that term anymore and just simply talk about the 17th century because they feel that the Golden Age is kind of like equivalent of the 1%. It's a slice of society.
Yes, exactly. And this term, the Dutch Golden Age, has been contested in some intellectual circles, particularly in the Netherlands, for the very reason that there was sort of the flip side of the coin. Not everything that you see is so perfect and idealized in the society at the time. Franz Post also goes to Brazil with an artist named Albert Ekko, and this is one of his really fabulous portraits of a Tupi man from Brazil. So the Dutch are bringing back all of these depictions of the flora and fauna of the New World. And this really fascinates patrons. Once they finish up with their expedition with colonial officials to Brazil, they will continue to create these subjects for the Dutch burger class at home.
And you know, everybody, I think, I remember, I'm on the older side, I think, these days, but we learned in school, elementary school even, about the Dutch East India Company. And we did not really learn about how much of that involved the slave trade. And that I think I read that something like 600,000 enslaved peoples were, you know, dealt with over the time period that the Dutch East India Company was involved in the trade. So it is all happening. The luxury comes from somewhere and at someone's expense.
Yes, absolutely. This entire empire is built upon the early transatlantic slave trade. And that's what results in bringing back many of these riches that we see here spread out on this table by Peter Clay, still life with turkey pie, which is really a feast for the eyes. And this is part of what the Dutch are very interested in, is a consumer culture.
So where do you think, I'm going to interrupt you here because it's really fun to look at these incredibly rich paintings and think about where things came from. So is that a Middle Eastern server that the fruit is in? You know, can we kind of look at some of these things and think about their origins?
Yes. You see here a rug that's in this Peter Clay still life. This clearly comes from the Islamic world. This could be a Dutch Delft piece of ceramics, but it's not quite clear. It could be Chinese export porcelain. And we've got a bird here, which could be native to Europe, but it sure looks sort of like a turkey to me. It's kind of very interesting, all of this. And then we've got a Nautilus Cup, which, you know, these objects would have been dredged from or taken up from the sea. You have to go and
right, and the way it's mounted, I mean, obviously it's mounted like a treasure, right? These are exotic things that are being given this treatment.
Yes, and it's a delight for the eyes. It's delectable. We've got red, we've got what looks like an orange here, and look at the reflection here in this pewter coffee pitcher here. It's quite something. And you can see the reflection of the light off the wine as well. So the Dutch art is very much about this consumer and material culture that is developing in the Netherlands. And here are a couple of portraits of the kinds of Dutch burghers that would have commissioned works from artists like Rembrandt and his contemporaries. Frans Hals, who's slightly older than Rembrandt, but is an important model for the artist, particularly in Rembrandt's early career.
So that's kind of a sober Frans Hals to me.
Yes, it is. It's not quite as sort of dashing as some of, and quickly executed as some of his later works, for sure. And this one is from 1625 of Jacob Olekhan. And look at just the attention to detail on the man's costume here. You can see the very intricate patterns. Look at his lace cuffs and his collar too.
And in an effort to try to expand our worldview, I might have moved away from the Netherlands a little too far. So another thing I don't think you mentioned was that, you know, Leiden is a center of education. There are university systems. You know, Rembrandt went to a Latin school. So, you know, the internal benefits of this prosperity are huge.
Yes, absolutely. And Leiden is also a center of science as well. There are many scientists who are based there. And Amsterdam, where Rembrandt is going to move, and that's where he's sort of going to flourish and have his peak out as success. Amsterdam is a center of publishing, intellectual activities, and also artistic production. And as I mentioned before, the Dutch take great pride in their landscape. And here you can see these this view of Overveen from these dunes, and you can see these workers who are stretching out linens to dry in the sun.
They take great pride in their cows, and I don't think we have any cattle pictures in here, but it is a little bit of a I did a Dutch Golden Age show once where my curatorial staff was kind of rebelling against the quantity of cattle in the exhibition.
Yes, we'll see some animals afterwards as we move along. Might be a couple of cattle in there.
Cheese and dairy, and also meat production. These are big things.
Yes, and the power harnessed from the waterways, which mark the Netherlands. Here we see the windmills that Jacob van Ruysdael included in this landscape. And look at the church dominating Overveen here. This is really quite something. And that speaks to the importance of Protestantism, at least in the northern Netherlands. In the southern Netherlands, it's Catholicism.
Right.
So,
and the low horizon, that is so Dutch. You see so much sky. They're the lowlands.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Dutch are fabulous landscapists. We have the emergence also of women artists such as Judith Leister. This one is down at the National Gallery in Washington. This is a fabulous self-portrait, really well executed. And you can see her at her easel here, and she's working on this picture of what looks like a violinist, very spontaneous. So the Dutch are very self-conscious. They're very also confident in their abilities. And you can see that in portraits like this one. We also have the very famous Johannes Vermeer, a woman holding a balance. And as I mentioned before, Vermeer was from Delft. He's really one of the most well-known of the Dutch painters. Slightly later, well, contemporary of Rembrandt, but slightly later. And here you have him depicting this woman holding a balance, which has all kinds of allegorical connotations. And you can see here this sort of commentary on the weighing of souls, because there's a picture in the background showing the Last Judgment with Christ presiding over it. And this also brings up the issues of people who were still Catholics in the Dutch Republic as well. And look at all her jewels here as well, these aspects of material life. And then the light comes in through the window. And it just beautifully illuminates the scene. As time goes on, the Dutch will become increasingly wealthy. And you can see this in works by artists like Gerard ter Borch with the Suitor's Visit from about 1658. And the Dutch grow increasingly wealthy, and many times they try to take on the airs of aristocrats. And this is partially a result of developments on the European continent, particularly in France, for example, where the latest fashions are being imported back into the Netherlands. So Dutch society is going to change a little bit from the more simple, sort of simple pursuits of the earlier generation of Dutch burghers. But look at the details here. Again, you have these oriental carpets that figure in here. You can see the musical instruments. And then the background makes it a bit mysterious with the black as this gentleman enters the room. And we have a dog. Tremendous attention to detail on the sheen of her silk dress here. Just striking.
So dog, that reminds me that there's so much symbolism embedded in a lot of these genre scenes, and dogs are often symbols of loyalty, and sometimes you have maps on the wall alluding to both the trade empire and a sense of worldliness. It's always really fun to really closely read these paintings.
Yes, they have many different hidden aspects of symbolism, and you can see here one of those export wares from Asia set up on top of this large cabinet. And this is by Peter de Hoogh, who was a master of the Dutch interior. And sometimes some of his works were even mistaken for Vermeer's. So you can really look deeply into these pictures for different kinds of meanings. And here we come to a very interesting artist that Sarah's going to discuss a little bit more, named Jan Stein.
Yes. So yeah, and there are a few things. We always try to make this be a little bit of a conversation. Sorry for interjecting with Daniel, but that's kind of part of what we're trying to do here is play off of each other. And I wanted to read this. There is before I get into Jan Stein, one of the books that is most well known about the Dutch Golden Age is Simon Schumann's The Embarrassment of Riches. And I loved this New York Times review of his book from 1987 by someone named Harold Beaver. The headline for the book review was "Healthy, Wealthy, and Worried," and worried too, which I kind of loved. And he describes, for soon in their fine roughs, Dutch burghers were choking on Ming porcelain, Anatolian carpets, Lyon silk, Venetian mirrors, Japanese lacquerware, Brazilian emeralds, East Indian sapphires, Oriental spices, exotic Turkish tulips, blue, which we haven't even mentioned tulips. Tulip mania is a thing. Blue and white faience, Delft tiles, dazzling white Haarlem linen, and above all, to every visitor's surprise, hundreds of engravings and oil paintings hanging in even the most ordinary tradesmen's houses. So, and that was just pulled from a book review that I thought was really well said. And when, I'm going to talk a little bit about Jan Stein because I know the painting really well that I am planning to talk about. But when we think about this period, we talked a little bit in the beginning that that there's more about everyday life, and that's connected to the Protestant Reformation and the rise in secular art and people, ordinary people, having the means to have art in their homes. And so there is this open art market. There are dealers, there are commissions, and it's not for the church. So at the same time, you have other artists, working for the Catholic Church, creating these grand sort of propaganda paintings for the Counter-Reformation, trying to pull people back to the Catholic Church. And then you have these much more modest, domestic, but fascinating paintings, which is, I think, part of the reason we're fascinated with this time period, because there's this incredible store of imagery that allow us to get deeply involved. So Daniel, you can go ahead and put the Jan Stein on and I'll start talking about it. So I think most folks may know that I came here in July from the Frick in Pittsburgh, where I worked for a long time. And this painting by Jan Stein was in their collection, the music lesson. And if anybody, not getting a lot of people answering chat questions here, but I'd be interested in knowing how people respond to this painting, because so many people would come to me. And it's a little, you know, it's a little domestically scaled painting meant to be in someone's home. And a lot of people found this guy, you know, sort of terrifying and off-putting, demonic, you know, towering over this woman. And I always found the painting really charming. So I'll explain to you my particular love of this painting. First of all, the idea of a music lesson, you can spend a lot of time just looking at music lessons in Dutch art, in genre painting, you know, outside of Holland as well. And, you know, it's often a scene of seduction. So you have this woman and looks just gorgeously dressed, the velvet, the fur, her hair ornament. I put a detail on the other side, her pearl earrings, everything is just beautiful. I always say those eyelashes, flush cheeks and eyelashes is beautiful, you know, 400 some years after it being painted as they were, you know, the day, or 300 some, bad math on my part, as they were when Jan Stein painted them. So there's often a subtext of, you know, seduction here. And of course, she's playing a recorder, which is maybe more of a double entendre than we want. But anyway, what's really lovely about this, and of course you have like a glass of beer, probably beer there on the side, and the piece of furniture that's there, that's large in the background, is probably a bed. They had these big sort of cabinet style beds. So they're all wedged together in this tight space, but she is so pretty, so fresh. And then you find out that this is actually Jan Stein himself. We'll look at him in some other paintings in a moment. Standing in, he often modeled in his own works. And you know, there's a Dutch expression, a Jan Stein household, which refers to disorderly household. In this prosperous Dutch Republic, order, you know, domestic balance and domestic comforts were really valued, and the idea that the governance of your household sort of reflected well on the whole of society. So there's this emphasis on a orderly domestic life and cleanliness too. So he would paint these paintings of disorder, and we'll see a couple of them as we go through. And people, it became a Dutch saying, a Jan Stein household. But he himself actually, you know, had a pretty stable life. He marries his master's daughter. He apprentices with Jan van Goyen, who does gorgeous seascapes, and he marries Van Goyen's daughter, Margriet, who's known as Grietje. And in fact, this is probably Grietje, and it's definitely Jan Stein. I love that he puts himself in his paintings, and it often deflects the moralizing a little bit, because he's not putting himself higher than us. He's not preaching to us. He has a great sense of humor. He might be saying, telling us lessons we need to know, and you'll see a few of examples of that, but he never puts himself above the rest of us. So just, you know, to cut to the chase here, I always read this as a portrait of a marriage, that he can be crazy and, you know, domineering and all this outward masculine energy. And she looks so serene, like she just knows how to deal with everything that he might have coming at her. And so I've always really quite loved this as a portrait of sort of energies in balance with each other. So Daniel, if you want to go through to the next image, here's a really famous Jan Stein called Girl Eating Oysters. She has this coquettish look on her face. There's no question, you know, oysters then were also considered an aphrodisiac. So we've got, again, these sort of some luxury commodities here. The same hair ornament, I believe, in her hair. same kind of fur trimmed outfit, but a very flirtatious painting from the period. And if you go on, I think we have a self-portrait of him from a bit later. Unfortunately, I think by this point, I have my dates written down here somewhere. Where are they? Can't find them. They were married for a little over 20 years and had 8 children, but she died right around the time I think that he did this self-portrait. And if you read accounts of the time, she was apparently pregnant when they got married, and he had to go to Van Goyen and tell him, and then he had to go to his own father and tell him, and I don't know how much of this is actually documented and true and just hearsay based on his reputation. A lot of people think of Jan Stein as being a sort of disorderly, drinking, social kind of guy because of the content of his paintings, but really he produced more than 800 paintings, and he was a tavern owner and a brewer, which probably helped him with his subject matter. And most people now think he had to have been very disciplined to have the career he had. And so associating him with his artwork is not at all fair. But here we see him in a self-portrait, and now we can see how he inserts himself into various paintings. So he's in this fantasy interior, and this is a tribute kind of painting. It's not at all any negative associations here. If you go into the next one, I think it's more fun. I just wanted people to get a sense of what he looks like. So here, the dancing couple, I didn't pull out the detail, but Daniel can probably zoom in for us. He's the guy over there on the left who's smiling and kind of tickling that woman on the cheek. So you see here this real interest in the interactions of people. And some of them, I think our next example, we've got a lot of things going on in the chat here. So here, this one we have, you can read, it's a kind of dark image, but you can read the left and the right hand of the images separately. And we have there in the background, Fortune in the painting, standing on a dice. So this sense that all of these material things are really up to chance. And there's I think, broken eggshells on the floor, and there's various other signs of fragility and ephemerality going on around the folks at the table. And that's Jan Stein himself, obviously there at the middle of the table, enjoying himself, but perhaps aware of the temporal nature of these kinds of pleasures. Another thing that people say is, that the Dutch seemed a little bit uncomfortable with their own happiness. So there, this tendency to moralize, the interest in still lifes that talk about mortality and death and speak to the passing of time. It's all perhaps connected to this, the Protestant work ethic and Calvinism in a way. So
yes,
I'm not sure if go ahead, Daniel.
One thing I wanted to add here is I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, notice that the decoration of these interiors is getting even more elaborate at this time.
Yeah.
This would be an example of a Dutch Baroque interior with very intricately carved plaster work that's painted. And look at the gilded frame here around this picture over the fireplace. So they're becoming ever increasingly wealthy.
Absolutely. Okay, now we're going to get into the exhibition a little bit more.
Yes, and this exhibition tries to show at the start of it as the precursors to Rembrandt's creative abilities as a printmaker. So it starts off with some works from the late 16th and early 17th centuries, such as this really very detailed engraving by Peter Jans Sennerdam, who was an important source of inspiration for the artist. And this depicts the famous parable of the wise and foolish virgins. And this one is in the Reading Public Museum's collection. It is on view in the exhibition. And look at how this artist has handled these really outstanding contrasts between light and dark. Look at the foliage here. And then also you have the rays of light with this Latin motto coming out of this peak hole at the top of the doorway. And then you can see also the use of the light emanating over here from inside the house, inside the compound. These kinds of things are going to give Rembrandt great inspiration for creating his own etchings. And as a matter of fact, Rembrandt was a collector of both prints and drawings. And
sorry, I got excited when I saw the cattle.
Yes, we've got some cattle here, and this one is by Schelte Adamson Bolsvert, which is after the famous printmaker Abraham Blomert, and it shows the prodigal son hiring himself to a farmer. Another one of these very important biblical subjects, and the prodigal son is part of a series of paintings that Rembrandt does later in his career. But what's really neat about this, and why I select this one in particular, is look at how Bolsward, after Blomert, placed this biblical scene within a Dutch peasant barnyard. And you can see that this is very important. It's about bringing the subject that sometimes would have been represented perhaps in a more grand setting, it brings it down to earth and into the contemporary condition of Dutch viewers in a means of relating and connecting to them. And this is something that Rembrandt's going to do too. He's going to cast his scenes in spaces that are familiar to contemporary viewers. And here we come to one that's really quite outstanding that's in the exhibition. It's quite enigmatic as well. It's called Dr. Faustus. And scholars have tried to speculate on this print. Before I sort of talk about some of the potential meanings, I want to point out the signature technique that Rembrandt uses in his etchings. And it's known as chiaroscuro, contrast between light and dark. And this print really epitomizes that, in which he has done really interesting things to ink his etching plate. And then, of course, the etching plate is placed in an acid bath. And so he's done really fabulous things with this to achieve these effects. And then afterwards, it's going to be put into a press. So Rembrandt was really a master at manipulating this printmaking technique to achieve these really interesting details and contrasts, as you can see here. Whether or not this represents Dr. Faustus from the story of Christopher Marlowe's play that was staged in the Dutch Republic at that time, we don't know. Perhaps it is. Dr. Faustus being famous for having traded his soul for magical powers from the devil. And he stares up at this enigmatic disc here that includes the initials of Jesus of Nazareth. We can see this hand pointing to another disc with this burst of light. And Rembrandt is really about this. He creates these humble settings in which these really sometimes grand events unfold. You can see that also in Christ driving the money changers from the temple. And in terms of Rembrandt looking to other forms of Renaissance art for inspiration, we've got over here a print by Dürer, which he was very well aware of and may have had in his collection, of Christ expelling the money changers from the temple from his small passion from 1509. And Rembrandt is really quite adept at doing this. You see how Christ has this sort of divine power. The light is emanating from his hand here. He has the whips in his hand. But in the background, the elders of the temple, some of them are so absorbed they don't even know what's going on over here as he's trying to cast out this chaotic crowd of money changers from the temple. And there we've got some cattle. This cow is running amok within the temple itself. So it's very dramatic. And then it looks like a dog here is barking and reacting to Jesus's actions here. So there's an element of humor too.
I'm going to unmute. We had a question, Daniel, which was, isn't Rembrandt known for his experimentation with printmaking? And he absolutely is. And maybe you could talk about that a little.
Yes, he is a master printmaker, and he experimented with very different techniques of etching. And he produced over 300 etchings in his career. And many of them were produced even down through the 19th century. So certain publishers would get a hold of these plates. In some cases, we're going to see as we go along the slides, other artists who would obtain the plates and then run another print set or series of them, they were done in different states, would make alterations to them.
Right. So he could, for those of you, just a little review of what happens with etching. So the plate, which would have been copper, right, in Rembrandt's time, gets coated with something they call the ground, which is like a resiny, waxy substance that's put on it. And essentially that's protecting the metal. And then the artist would work into that, exposing the metal which then when you put it in an acid bath, it bites those areas of exposed metal. So it's what we call intaglio printmaking, because it's an incision in the plate. And those recesses are going to hold the ink. So after the acid bath and you ink the plate, you're then wiping it with something called a tarlatan. So you're removing the excess ink. You just have the ink that's been embedded in the grooves, goes through the etching press under pressure and damp paper, and pulls the image. But you could go in and you could maybe stop out an area and decide to put the rest of the plate in more acid to get darker colors. You could do all sorts of ways of altering and playing with the image while also reworking the same general ideas.
Yes, and Rembrandt would do this, and that's what led to his development of different states of particular subjects. So sometimes he would do up to 5, sometimes 6 states of a particular image.
So that's actually kind of a technical term. The state it refers to a particular rendition of the plate that's printed.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And Rembrandt, in terms of casting, for example, the scene of the Annunciation to the shepherds, he draws an inspiration in terms of placing within this wild landscape, and in some ways almost takes over the subject from artists like Jan van Wonderzil. This is a work that's in the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts collection, which is from a little bit earlier, but it's really outstanding. And you can see how lush the landscape is with the leaves and the foliage. Really quite amazing. And if you put the Rembrandt side by side with it, you can see sort of where he's deriving inspiration. Other works in the exhibition include the Stoning of St. Stephen, which is really a very dramatic and also
it actually bothers me. I don't really like to look at this because he does seem so helpless in the position of his legs, and it's lost shoe.
It's harrowing. He's in torment. It's really sort of a horrific scene. And Rembrandt really does a fabulous job of capturing that. See the contrast between light and dark again here, the chiaroscuro. You can see the rays of light shining down from the sky up above. This was something that Rembrandt was familiar with in a very early painting. In fact, the first to be signed by the artist, called the Stoning of St. Stephen from 1625. And like Jan Stein, see, Rembrandt represents himself within the picture. This was a common thing that Dutch artists would do at the time. And that's a detail of the artist down below at a very young age. He also, though, doesn't just do the religious subjects. He has scenes from everyday life. This one called The Golf Player, which you see sort of an economical use of line and hatching to establish these contrasts. It was a kind of Dutch version of croquet. And this man inside is sort of taken a rest from it. He sits in contemplation in the shadows while his friends are still playing outdoors. Very interesting in terms of seeing both things going on at the same time. Rembrandt was also a consummate landscapist. And this is one of his unfinished landscapes, where you see again the contrast between light and dark, which are very stark indeed. People of the streets are also fascinate the artist. And as his career goes on, he becomes more and more fascinated with these sort of bohemian characters, if you want to call them, such as an old man seen from behind.
So this is a not quite apropos interjection, not really related to this fellow, except that I'm thinking about the gamut of society. And, earlier I used the expression 1%, but there was prosperity generally throughout the Republic, my understanding is, but, there were beggars and there were street people, and, Rembrandt and others were fascinated by looking at them. But one thing I forgot to mention when I was showing the images of Gritja and Jan Stein is that there was actually a sort of feminist is maybe too strong of a word, but women did have a stronger, perhaps more equitable role in society. They were generally the exemplars of the household, which we see, through a lot of cultures, but they had a little more independence. Young women, the story I told about Jan Stein and his wife is perhaps not an uncommon story, because young women and men courting often had more privacy and autonomy than you would expect.
Yes. Thanks for pointing that out, Sarah. The idea of gender roles are often very clearly defined in Dutch painting, and they raise lots of interesting questions, and it's a subject in which you can sort of take it in a direction into and onto itself. So absolutely. And Rembrandt certainly spells some of these out in many of his compositions, such as this etching that we have in our collection of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, which is very dramatic. And sometimes Rembrandt did use his wife and mistresses as his models, which could be the case for this one. I would have to check again, but I wouldn't put it past the artist at all.
It's so dramatic and it's so tiny, right? And
yes,
you really get the sense. So she's trying to get him in bed. She's trying to, very, very brazenly seduce him. And she actually pulls him out of his coat, right? So unlike other treatments I've seen of this subject, you really get the physicality in Rembrandt. You
really do. And he even includes a little anecdotal detail. See the chamber pot below there.
Yeah.
So
Rembrandt. We did have a question come in about, was the rise in printmaking related to the rise in consumerism, essentially? Are there more prints because more people are interested in art?
Absolutely, yes. You have the development, as you mentioned earlier, Sarah, of the art market. And as people become increasingly prosperous, they want to be able to have works that they can enjoy and look at personally. And certainly prints fit this bill because they're small and can be bound together in small volumes. And you can have them and look at them whenever you may desire, in addition, of course, to what would have been called cabinet paintings for the Dutch interior. Mm-hmm. And this is a view of one of those copper plates. This one is in the Rembrandt house in Amsterdam. And you can see that what happens is the reverse of the image is produced. This is the actual plate itself. And here's the image created from it. Just thought you would like to see that. That's where these images come from, is this kind of copper plate.
You can often tell when you're studying artwork, sometimes somebody is copying another artist and the composition is reversed and they were working from a print. Because sometimes paintings, when they were translated into prints, were occasionally, not righted in the process.
And you can see the incisions there of where the ink would fall into place. And then later the paper, once it's put in the press, is going to catch all of that too. So that's the sort of physical object. And you can see them side by side here. I see that we are coming up on the sort of the 7 o'clock mark there. So I want to make sure that we get to some more works in the exhibition, but I'll briefly mention that in our museum, we do have, as many other collections have, a painting that was once believed to be by Rembrandt the master himself, but it turned out to be an 18th century copy. But it still tells an interesting story. The work on the right is in our collection, and it is an 18th century copy of one done, the only one done of Rembrandt portraying himself as a Dutch burgher. And you can see here he has the lace collar, but the refinement of the work in the Glasgow Museums and the Burrell collection is lacking here in the WCMFA version. And you can certainly tell it from the shadow and the light that falls on Rembrandt's face. But I thought I would bring this in to show you. And then he derived this composition originally from another etching that he did around 1631. And then if you put all three side by side, you can see it in more detail. I will be talking more about the WCMFA copy in one of my upcoming programs, The Curator's Den. But this portrait nevertheless tells an interesting story, and Rembrandt had many followers and copyists, and that's what makes it so difficult sometimes to find an attribution to who might have done them, possibly done by also members of his workshop. There are many works done after him. In the exhibition, we have one of those people who worked in his studio with him, a man named Jan van Vliet, and this is called Laughing Man in a Gorget. This was a part of a series of what were called tronies, these character studies that Rembrandt did. You also have Rembrandt's competitor, Jan Levens, in his fabulous etching and Drypoint print of St. Jerome and Penitence from about 1631. You can see how Jan Levens, like Rembrandt, is using the chiaroscuro to really fabulous effects. Or in his very humble portrayal of St. Anthony from about 1631. Jan van Vliet also continued to do these portraits after Rembrandt. This one possibly a portrait of Rembrandt's father, of an old man. It's also in the exhibition. It's one of my favorites because of the way that the light is in shadow or contrasted on his head. And then, of course, he has this very large and sort of domineering black cloak. But keep in mind, this print is really tiny, so it's much larger on the screen. And we had mentioned before how these plates could be reworked. Here is an Irish artist by the name of William Bailey, who did a print after Rembrandt's famous The Three Trees. And I want you to see, when you put these two side by side, what Bailey has done. He's taken some romantic liberties here in the mid 18th to early 19th century by adding the lightning bolts to the print that are not at all visible in the Rembrandt off to the right. So he's added in some of these atmospheric effects. He's altered the composition sort of to bring it up to date into the 18th century romantic interpretation. You can also see the wind blowing against the trees here too. And here's one of Rembrandt's paintings, Landscape with a Long Arched Bridge, to show you some of the similarities that he brings in terms of the chiaroscuro, transposing them from painting to printmaking. And you can see when you put these two side by side, some of those effects. The exhibition, though, also shows his contemporaries and followers, such as Karel Dujardin, who was a Dutch artist who worked down in Italy. In the landscape here, you'll see this in Dutch art of the time period, is not at all limited to the landscapes of Holland. There are oftentimes depictions of places far away, such that Dutch burghers wanted to bring to them views that they might not ordinarily see in their daily lives. And sometimes with anthropomorphic features, such as this tree root that almost has these eyes that stare out at the viewer. And you've got these travelers with what look like goats or cattle on the left-hand side.
So was this one of the Benteuffel?
I believe he was, yes.
So they're an interesting group of Dutch artists who go and sort of band together in Italy. They're known for their sort of partying, right? And
yes, they're rabble rousers.
Yeah, and these, you know, the primacy of the landscape, what we'd say an Italian landscape, and often with these figures, you know, they're called staffage. They're sort of, you know, anecdotal figures that create a little bit maybe of narrative in the scene, but not generally a lot.
Yes. And here, though, we see the figures with Cornelis de Fischer a bit more pronounced. Here we've got we've got a donkey, cattle, and dogs here. And this one, though, is an engraving. And the engravings sometimes achieve much more detail, depending on how they're done.
So we did have a question about Drypoint technique, and I don't know if we're going to have another image coming up that's a Drypoint, but at some point you could maybe address the idea of what the Drypoint technique is.
Yes, hopefully we can get there. We've got another artist who's part of this group, or at least in the tradition of this group of the Benteuffels, these Dutch artists who go down to Rome. And they're really outstanding works in terms of the use of the attention to detail, the foliage and the vegetation. We have a castle up here on the cliff, and we've got these travelers, one of whom stopped along his way. You can see even the detail here. He has his walking stick. He's on a crutch. And this one has some bearing on a landscape that we have in our collection by the Flemish painter working in the Dutch tradition named Lucas van Uden. And if you put the two side by side, you can see these elements working together in terms of this not being necessarily a native Dutch scene, but again, that, as Sarah mentioned, the Italian landscape.
And I also see, particularly in like Wouverman, you see the seeds of the fête galante, right? The French 18th century painting in a lot of these.
Yes, absolutely. This one, I'm not sure if this one is a Drypoint, but you know, Sarah, you might be able to speak to it offhand. I cannot recall the exact difference between the Drypoint, aquatint, and traditional etching.
So yeah, I haven't boned up on aquatint, but Drypoint, I believe, is just you're going right into the plate. You're not scratching away at the ground to expose it to acid. You actually are, you know, and so you get the burr, the characteristic little metal shards as you scar the plate essentially. And that burr will make things a little featherier, and you'll also get a different kind of taper to the end of the line. I know my husband is on here somewhere, and he's an etcher, so he can put in the chat if he feels like it, anything I got wrong about dry point or anything he'd like to add.
But some of these etchings, the level of detail is really amazing, like in this Paulus Potter print, which I might add, he is the consummate cattle painter and printmaker in the 17th century Netherlands. But here he's created this noble portrait of these two horses. Look at the attention to detail on the horse's coat here. It's just outstanding. I'm not sure if this one is a dry point, but it is possible that it is. We also have works that deal with scenes of daily life, like Adrian van Ostada's Two Gossips, in which these two women have stopped to chat with one another. And you can see in the background a group of people buying something from what looks like a peddler or a dealer. And that's what these prints in the show also focus on, are these moments in time. And also Cornelis Bega, Man Looking Out a Window, in which we have frozen a particular person sort of absorbed in their thoughts, their activities. And this aspect of absorption, of really being sort of consumed with what you're doing, is another important aspect of 17th century Dutch art. Some get very humorous. We had talked about Jan Stein before. Here we have an Ostada of a group of peasants in an inn where things have really gone awry, in which the child tries to calm down the adults here who are engaged in some kind of terrible argument. And over here, this man has gone over and it looks like he's about to pick up this poker at the fireplace. Hopefully he's not going to resort to violence.
The things sometimes do get very ugly.
Yes.
In tavern scenes. And I shouldn't say that we, anecdotally, the expression Dutch courage kind of relates to these tavern scenes where Genevra, I believe it was the drink that in England gets modified and becomes gin. And of course, Hogarth gives us, warns us as to overconsumption of gin. But here, we have a lot of Genevra and a lot of beer and cider, also pancakes and waffles. Yeah, a little too much of that could give you too much Dutch courage, and you might get in a circumstance you shouldn't be in.
Yes, such as a circumstance here. For example, in Jan Stein's Beware of Luxury, which is in Vienna. And this one, I mean, we could talk a lot about it, but this is one of the Dutch households on awry. Everything is a mess. You have the cuckoo clock being tampered with by a monkey, traditionally seen as a symbol of evil. We have this woman over here, these parents who are, trying to read out passages from the Bible, but their kids, their son, daughter-in-law here have no interest whatsoever. And this is based upon a Dutch parable, a very old one in their culture. And then over here, the nurse has fallen asleep and the kids are in the larder raiding it.
Smoking?
Yes, the kid is even smoking over here and the dog is eating the pie. It's a household.
The Jan Stein household.
Yes. So this is sort of quintessentially Jan Stein. And then the flames of passion here, as you can see, as he's sitting down with the young woman here.
Yeah, she got her hand on his garter or something.
She does, yes. And she has a pitcher of wine in her right hand. So, but this has a moralizing theme to it. And the idea of
also entertaining.
Yes, absolutely. And we do have a Dutch interior in our collection, and right now it's in the process of being restored. But I bring it in because it has a bearing and a relationship to one of the prints in the exhibition. And once it's restored, it's going to be much crisper than this. But you'll note how Adrian van Ostade and Gerrit's Dekker here, they really use these motifs, such as the timber ceiling of the house, and also the windows through which the light sort of imbues the scene. These ones, though, are much calmer. A peasant settling his debt, and then in the painting on the right, this is a family going about their daily duties. And in this regard, the Dekker would be the polar opposite of the Jan Stein that we saw before.
So we did have a comment in the chat about, the interest in humanity, which is, absolutely true. And I think it's probably an oversimplification to say this, But so much when art is related to the patronage of the aristocracy or the church, it carries a whole different set of a whole lot of other weight to it in terms of needing to express status, needing to express elitism and education and your knowledge of history or your knowledge of mythology. Whereas when you start having a middle class art market, you have paintings that speak a more common language, more vernacular.
Yes, absolutely. And you can see that in these Dutch genre scenes, such as the Peter Verhulst here of the young boy playing marbles that we have in our collection, which is really a jewel of a picture. It's really tiny. Again, the Dutch painting signs on the screen, they look to be so large, but they are very small. And the artist achieves so much in these works that are done on such a small scale. And that tremendous emphasis and attention to detail, the humanity of their subjects, this little boy playing marbles. You can even see the highlights on the objects themselves as he's paused for a moment here. We also have some dramatic subjects in the exhibition, this one by Cornelis de Fischer, of a pistol shot of a battle scene of robbers. And this one is a combination of the etching and engraving technique, which some of these printmakers did. They would actually combine both techniques in their work. And this one has a great contrast between light and dark chiaroscuro. So those are the sort of an overview of the works in the exhibition. And then I think I've got a couple more slides here. This is just a medley of some of our Dutch works in the collection and some of my favorites that you can see if you come to the museum, the Schalken, which is on view in the Old Masters Gallery, and also the Willem de Porter, which is also in the same space. We plan to exhibit some of these, definitely the Rembrandt, in the gallery corridor in the coming weeks.
So we're, I don't want to interrupt you, Daniel, if you have some more images, but we did get a comment on Drypoint. I think I was essentially right. Drypoint was more physical and often less calligraphic since the artist was actually moving metal around, requiring some force. The trough created by the etching needle held ink in an often fuzzy way. I did talk about that, not cleanly as an etched line. And the dry point was short-lived. This is a really good point because the burr gets worn down as you create prints from it. And so you're not going to get that dry point effect for nearly as many impressions as you would for a regular etching plate.
Great. Thank you for that extra detailed information. Those are all the images that I brought to show.
So we can take questions if anybody has any more questions. I had a great time talking about the Dutch Golden Age and putting the exhibition into a broader context. I hope that folks can get to the museum and see the show in person. It's one you could spend quite a lot of time looking at. The whole come up and see my etchings cliche. There is something to it because etchings are really engrossing, and the line quality is kind of enchanting in a way that they're absorbing in a different sort of way than other artworks. So if people don't have questions, I guess I will say, thanks so much for being with us, and do join us again December 10th when we go virtually over to the Netherlands and try and show you a little bit more about the country itself and some specific places there.
Yes, we're looking forward to seeing everybody again next time. Thank you so much for joining us. This was wonderful to share these works with you and discuss the Dutch Golden Age.
We do record these, and so we'll get it out pretty quickly. You can find it on the virtual page of our website. We usually post links on social media. If you get our weekly emails, you'll get it, and you can go to our YouTube page and also look at all of our videos there. This is episode 3, so you can watch the other 2 if you haven't seen them. And I thank you all so much for being here.
Oh, Carson, someone has offered this cocktail. Well, it looks much too exciting for something this early in the evening. What do you think, Carson?
Best to avoid it, my lady.
Yes, best to avoid it. But what we must not avoid, Carson, are the amazing tablescapes at the museum this year. They will begin in February, and they may be accessed, if I may check my card, at www.wcmfa.org.
Very good, milady.
Thank you. They will be shown online this year. Online, Carson, whatever that is.
Nice, yes.
It's as wild as that cocktail. Let me try it.